Hi, this is Rex with the second of two semifinal games for the Think Club Championship. Here we have Greedydragon with the white pieces and Dark-Bi5hop, who ended up winning this game, advancing to the finals with the black pieces. Compared to the last game I analyzed after the game was played, this game is much cleaner, and the players did take a lot more time on their moves. So by no means am I criticizing the players on their play here when I go over the moves that they made. And I actually applaud this game because it was really well played despite a relatively early blunder. So let's get into this game though. Another Queen's Pawn game with d4 played. This time the Queen's Indian defense, or just a regular Indian defense with Knight f6 played in response to d4. Uh, Looks like a relatively normal game with d5 played here. Usually in these lines we do sometimes see d6 in a very passive development for black's pieces, but d5 played by black means that it's still going to be a center focused game in the opening. And as they just play their usual moves here, nothing out of the ordinary for the first 10 moves. Development moves, and then because of the passive moves from black, white tries to make an early attack here with knight b5 on the c7 pawn. Basically, it's a free pawn at the moment. Knight a6 is the only move here. It's forced. There is no other way to stop it, because e5 would just directly give up a pawn. So knight a6 obviously was played, but if it wasn't, you could possibly win the rook. And then just standard development, c6 to push back the knight to c3. So right now it's very even. And then queen a5 is a move very early to attack from black, especially since they've been passive, but it's a very interesting move. And it's what eventually forces the blunder. So right here, you have a pinned knight from white. There is another way to attack the knight, so a double attack can be forced at the knight, but the pawn does defend it. And fortunately for white, the queen can come in to defend. The rook can slide over, so there's no check and stealing the rook. So it'll just be a down the pawn on the queen side, but good pieces still for white, and also good pieces for black. So it would be even if the knights were traded, for example. The issue here is that you see that the bishop can't come back for white because e3 was played prematurely. It's fine as the bishop does have a strong diagonal, but defensively it cuts off the knight. And because the king is still in the center, a check can come if the queen were to take. So a3 is played, which a3 isn't a bad idea. It's just to stop this knight from potentially coming here at some point to block that pin and eventually hit the king with a fork. There is also ideas of maybe putting the queen here, somehow putting pieces behind it, I don't know. But it's basically to cut off this b4 square. Not to play b4. The reason why is, which I'll show, because it was played. Knight e4, and castles is actually a very strong idea. It unpins the knight. Sure, you'll lose a pawn, but it's only temporary, and white's position is still very strong. There really isn't a lot of space for white, as white has grabbed a lot of space on the king side with this h4 move. There's really not a lot that black can do in development-wise. There is bringing the bishop over here, but then you're basically just going to trade it off for no good reason. So white is fine to castle here and go down a pawn. But b4 was played, and it's a blunder. The reason why is because the knight can come here, and after takes, the knight is still pinned. It's under double attack, and really the queen can come defend it, but that's about it. So you're going to lose the knight and 2 pawns for 1 knight. Well, 2 knights, I guess. But you're going to end up down the exchange here. You're going to end up down 2 pawns. It's just the way that it's going to end up being played out. It's very bad for white, as the king's still in the center. If the king had castled earlier, then the king would be safe, and there would be no checks here, check worries. when it comes to taking the knight. So anyway, knight takes b4, a takes b4, queen takes b4, and queen d3 to cover. Now, here it is suggested that knight takes c3. It still has a pin. The queen can't take back, and that's basically a free knight. Queen takes c3, check. Obviously, this threatens the rook and forces the queens off the board. If you see knight c3 here, knight b5 just blocks this pin of this pawn, so it's not a bad move. Queen b2 still threatens it, but basically you win the knight here, and you're just up 2 pawns. So queen takes c3, knight takes c3, and currently you're up 2 pawns. It's just the case that it is. And really, for white here, the reason why it's so bad being down 2 pawns so early is because you have no initiative with it. The bishop really doesn't have any way to come and attack towards the king. Coming here, sure, but then you're staring right into a pawn that's protected. The bishop can always come over. This bishop can easily be attacked after something like f6, e5. Obviously, this pawn is pinned, so black would not want to do that quite yet, because this pin does come in key later. The knight really only has one square to go, and after that, there isn't any attacking notion behind it, except maybe zigzagging this way and attacking the queen side. The rook here has nowhere to go. Rook lift wouldn't benefit at all, and castling would just be forcing white to attack on the queen side. But as you can see, black has a very strong queen side, so it would be really tough for white to do any sort of attack here. Game continues with some usual moves. Knight to the center, which is kind of an interesting move. The knight wasn't under attack, so you could have left it there and instead developed your pieces. So it was kind of just a premature move. After some knight moves here, either way, you can attack that knight and push it back further. And it says it's an accuracy, just it's not really an accuracy, but rather just an unnecessary move at the moment. So bishop takes e4 to trade the knight off the board, which is kind of a weird move because it forces your knight to move. And sure, you get to attack the pawn, but it can be defended as such. So now castles attacking, planning on attacking the queen side. This was actually a very clever move here because you will win a third pawn. Sure, there's c3 here temporarily, but you're basically just abusing this pin that you have on this pawn to this rook, which it will come in key much later. So a5 is played, just to grab some space and push the queenside pawns. And here's where black actually gives the game kind of back. So after b5, obviously this pawn is free. Now after castles, this rook is defended. This pin isn't so much as in play, since the pawn's still there and defended, so it takes 2 moves at least to attack that pawn. And after knight takes a5, rook f to c8 defends this pawn, and there's a couple ideas here. There's c4, which will attack this pawn, and after playing the bishop to defend it, basically you just trade the rook off the board, and you have these 2 oddly placed, well actually 3 oddly placed center pawns for black, and white actually has some counterplay, and even though the position is very open and the kings are safe, and black is up at this point 2 pawns still, and has the bishop pair while white has a knight. This knight is actually very nicely placed, and the pawns are very hard to defend. So it's a very playable position for white, even though it's slightly advantageous for black. And something like bishop e2 does defend this pawn. Placing the bishop here would be nice, and taking would actually solidify the position more for black. So it's not bad for black, and it's not necessarily good. But another idea would be for white to play rook f to b1, also hitting this pawn. So if, for example, takes, there is takes. c5, and rook takes b5 is forced. The reason why is because this attacks this pawn. You obviously can't take back, so you have to defend the knight in some manner. And after some trades, example of where it could go wrong though is, for example, rook a4. There's the bishop skewer, and the reason why black is just so much better here, if you were to play rook f to b1, is because these bishops are just going to harass the rooks. The bishop pair is so strong in too open of a position, so you'd have to play something like c4 here. The only other good move there for white to follow the knight takes a5 line is knight to b7, basically preventing c5 ideas. But rooks would be traded, and then c5 would still be fine, because if you were to take here, that's basically a free knight. c3 would actually be the only move here, and then after it would just be takes, and your knight's oddly placed, and the bishop pair, but black basically lost all their initiative on the queen side. They have one passed pawn, they have a pawn in the center here holding up, but it actually does look pretty even. Either way, that was missed to knight e5 instead. Just bringing the knight to the center in an odd position, probably to stop this pin. And that was basically the only reason why that pin would come in handy, just to see that idea, and then having to see that you need to play more passive move following, because knight b7 really isn't that aggressive. It's just a safe place you put the knight. c4 also isn't that aggressive. It's just to provoke a takes and go forward. Just making black's pawns very oddly placed. And that's about it. That was missed in that moment. Knight e5, and then the game continues with just standard play. Nothing really to comment on here. The knight was forced off the board in an unfortunate manner, and now you're just up a whole minor piece in the pawn. Obviously the pawn takes, but that advantage won't last long, as there are two weak pawns here in the center for white. And then after some unfortunate ideas, I'm not sure what the idea of bishop c7 is here, just potentially to allow the rook off in some manner. I don't know what the idea of bishop c7 was. At this point, he is low on time, so he was probably just looking for a move. And then rook b8 just blunders the bishop. So that's about it. White resigns after realizing they blundered the bishop. They were lost from move 11, and they did not see the one chance that they had to equalize the game. Overall, a very solid game, though. There's nothing really to commentate on. There were no super wow ideas from moves, just solid moves played. Kind of a boring game for me to analyze after, but it was a very well played game, and I'd much rather have this game, a similar game for the final, than a game with 20 blunders and only 5 minutes of the clock's use. So kudos to the players for making it this far, to make it to the semifinals. Dark-Bi5hop will move on to the finals of the Think Club Championship to play Windrunner, who had beaten E-Man, which was one of the players in the last video that I analyzed, and E-Man was going off of 2 upsets, so it was a surprising thing to see that 2 close players in E-Man actually had lost that time. And Greedydragon and E-Man will play in the 3rd place final for the basically bronze medal, even though there's no medals handed out here. But I'm looking forward to both of these games. We're going to see Dark-Bi5hop, one of the strongest players in the tournament. My personal pick from the beginning to win. Face off against Windrunner, who is a younger player who's been getting really strong in the past couple of months, and could very well end up winning the Think Club Championship, so it should be a good game. The same thing with Greedydragon and E-Man. They're both very similar level players, so either way, we're going to have 2